We already know when it comes to fantasy football, there's risk associated with everything we do. The best way to win our leagues, though, is to minimize that risk as much as possible. So to find out what we're dealing with, I figured I would give you all the definition of risk. As defined by vocabulary.com, risk describes something that is suggestive or close to being indelicate, improper, or indecent, especially in relation to that's risque. Nope, sorry, wrong thing. Yo, Headliner Nation, it is that time of the year when I break down my riskiest players at each position series. And we're gonna be kicking the series off by talking about running backs, looking at the top 20 running backs from last season, breaking down their risk factor, and are they still gonna be risky or not heading into 2023? So make sure you hit that like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, because you are not going to want to miss any of the off-season content that takes you deep like this one. Well, first off, let me explain what risk score is. I'm going through the games played for every running back in the top 20, and I'm gonna break down how many times did they finish as an RB1, as an RB2, as an RB3, and how many times outside the top 36 at their position. For every game you're a top 12, you get 1 point. For every game you go from 13 to 24, you get 2 points. From any game that is 25 to 36, you get 3 points. In any game outside the top 36, you get 5 points. We add it all up and then we divide it by the number of games that player played, and then we find out what their risk score is. And the lower the number, the better. And this video is not talking about upside. This video is trying to find who the safest running backs were last season. And if you're surprised by some of the scores, it doesn't mean that these guys won't have a lot of upside for you. It just means some of that upside might come with more risk. First and foremost, let's see what players finished with the most top 12 games last year. CMC, Eckler, and Barkley led the way with 10 RB1 games, followed by Henry and Jacobs with 9 of them. Nick Chubb had 8, while Ramondre Stevenson and Jamal Williams finished with 7. And maybe this won't come as any surprise to you, but the players that have the most top 12 finishes are going to be the safest players. The data and the numbers will show us that. But when we start to get outside the top 5 or so running backs, then you'll start to see how this can really help us figure out maybe like our RB2s or the safest RB1s if we miss out on the top options. And even though I just said that, I want you to keep one name in mind as we go through all of this, and it will be Najee Harris, who only had 3 RB1 performances all season. And of course, you're gonna want the guys with the most RB1 performances leading your team, especially if you're going to be drafting over on Underdog. And if you want to get signed up over on Underdog, do so now using our code HEADLINERS. Because if you sign up with our code and deposit at least $10, Underdog is going to match that deposit up to $100, and you're going to get a free draft guide. And considering our draft guide costs $21.99, you can get it for over 50% off by depositing and playing over on Underdog. Download the app, go to their website, code word headliners, sign up with a new account, deposit $10, and we'll get you that draft guide right away. But I want to give away a free draft guide right now. So down below in the comments, tell me who you think will have the most RB1 performances this season. If this video gets 750 likes, I'm going to pick one of you that leave a comment down below answering my question to win a free draft guide. And now if we take a look at the top 24 finishes, meaning they finished anywhere from RB13 to RB24. And I just mentioned keeping an eye on Najee Harris, who led the league with 7 RB2 performances last year. So even though he wasn't finishing as an RB1, which you more than likely would have wanted, he also wasn't killing your team either, because he was giving you enough numbers to at least help you stay steady. And Kenneth Walker was right behind him with 6 RB2 performances. And when you look at the bottom of this column and you see several of the top guys with 3 RB2 performances, that's not necessarily concerning. Our only hope is that these guys have more RB1 performances instead of having those RB2 numbers kind of float down into the RB3 category. But let's take a look at RB3 performances, and Najee Harris once again leads the way with 6 of those, which was tied with Leonard Fournette. Now, these RB3 RB3 performances are always going to be very frustrating because once again, you're going to look at the numbers next to your player's name and you're going to think, man, why couldn't they have just done a little bit more? And some of these RB3 numbers aren't necessarily going to lose you a week either, but they aren't going to win you any weeks. But it's interesting to note that guys like Ramondre Stevenson and Saquon Barkley went either way last year because neither of them finished with an RB3 performance. And Miles Sanders led the way with 7 performances outside the top 36. So he was a guy last season that was either winning you weeks or he was losing you weeks. And you're going to see when we take a look at his risk score in a second that absolutely that was true. And I just brought up a guy like Ramondre Stevenson who had 0 RB3 performances last season. But when you take a look at the numbers, he had 5 performances outside the top 36. But I think you also need to look and understand why a guy finished outside the top 36. Because you look at a guy like Travis Etienne who had 5 performances outside the top 36. But when you look at his numbers, you see that he didn't start a game up until week 6. So he was splitting a ton of touches with James Robinson. And then towards the end of the season, he ended up having to leave 2 games early. So those 2 games that he left early contribute to the top 36. And on top of it, you've got those games earlier in the year where he may not have given you much of a performance. So sometimes when taking a look at the risk score, you might say, hey, this guy was super risky. Let's go look at the box scores and see maybe why some of these games happened. And then you got to look at guys also like Ramondre Stevenson and Kenneth Walker, who may not have been the starters to begin the year. So where did those games outside the top 36 come from? Are they games in which they didn't get a ton of touches? And if so, maybe we need to bake that into this a little bit. But then you got a guy like Jamal Williams, who was true a 50% split backfield with DeAndre Swift last year. So you take a look at Jamal Williams and say, hey, just like Miles Sanders, a guy that was one of the starting backs, still getting a ton of touches, wasn't leaving games early, still a very, very high percentage of their games ended up being outside the top 36 because they were truly boom or bust players. And I think it's high time y'all start putting some respect on Nick Chubb. I know our community here definitely respects the dude and know he's one of the best running backs in all of football, but along with Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler, who are considered top 3 or 4 picks this season, Nick Chubb also had 0 games outside the top 36 last year. And once again, Najee Harris didn't give you many top 12 performances, but he did only give you 1 game outside the top 36. Glass half full. All right, let's take a look at the overall risk score now. And again, keep in mind, the lower the score, the better. Anyone that finished below a 2 is marked in green, and those are going to be considered our safest running backs from last season. And again, the top guys are all listed here, right? You take a look at the correlation between top 12 games and where they finish in terms of risk score, and absolutely, these guys right here are some of the safest running backs that you can get. So even if you feel like taking a running back in the first round is risky for your roster, as long as the guys stay healthy, it's actually one of the safest things that you can do. Because when you get outside those top guys that you're going to be drafting, maybe into the round 2, round 3, round 4, those are going to be the guys that, yeah, if they hit, they're going to hit big, and we love that for our roster, but they also might cost you some weeks. All right, anyone that scored from a 2 to a 2.5 is going to be listed in yellow here. And I think it's very interesting that James Conner comes in as a 2.15. The dude was actually fairly safe last season, even if it didn't feel like it on your team. And again, Najee Harris is pretty high here. Didn't win you a whole lot of weeks. You probably weren't super excited about many of his performances, but also he wasn't losing you a ton of weeks at the running back position either. And Joe Mixon finishes in this category as well. And I know a lot of you Joe Mixon owners from last year probably don't feel like it because he only really won you 1 week last year. But if you take a look at the numbers, he was actually fairly safe. So even if he didn't win you a lot of weeks, he also didn't lose you many either. And Tony Pollard and Zeke Elliott, again, a lot of owners frustrated last year at times owning these guys because you didn't really know who was going to score, who wasn't going to score, where was the volume going to go, how was the backfield going to be split. But they put up enough decent games that their risk score was fairly low. And Ramondre Stevenson, if he didn't have 5 games outside the top 36, and could have just pushed some of those numbers into the RB3 category, he would have scored much higher as well. Will that change this year considering he's going to be the starter? All right, anything 2.5 to 2.75 is going to be thrown into the orange category here. Already mentioned Jamal Williams, right? Truly boomer bust. Aaron Jones last year was kind of in the same boat. At times with his receiving capabilities, he could win you a week, but it felt like he got scripted out of the game plan a little too often. But moving from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, I think that changes this year. And Dalvin Cook, who actually didn't have that bad of a season last year, ended up being tied with Aaron Jones. Kenneth Walker ends up falling pretty low here, but once again, if he could have pushed some of those games outside the top 36 into RB3 territory, it really would have helped his score and he would have looked a lot safer. But the problem is, when you talk about him compared to like a Ramondre Stevenson, who may have been in the same boat, one of them isn't going to have a ton of competition for targets, and the other one, well, they drafted Zach Charbonnet. Kenneth Walker, even though I love him, could end up falling really low on this risk category again next season because Charbonnet could get so many touches. Leonard Fournette, also very underwhelming along with that offense last year. It's really no surprise to me that his score was so low. All right, anybody above a 2.75 gets labeled in red, and it absolutely does kill me that Travis Etienne was all the way down here. But once again, I already mentioned it with him. The reason his risk score is where it's at is because number one, he was splitting so many touches at the beginning of the season with James Robinson, and number two, he ended up leaving 2 games early later in the season where his performance was outside the top 36. So it really would be interesting to break this down in more of a stretch run to see if the times that Travis Etienne was the starter and not leaving early, if he was far less risky. Keep that in mind when doing your research. Let me tell you, this number doesn't change anything for me and Travis Etienne. He's still my boy, and I still think he greatly outplays Tank Bigsby this season. And Alvin Kamara and Miles Sanders. Again, Kamara is no surprise. He had a lot of up and downs last year, and that offense wasn't all that good. The riskiest thing about him this year is we don't even know if he's going to play or how long he could be suspended for. And then Miles Sanders had a really good season last year, but once again, I already mentioned it. He was either winning you weeks or he was losing you weeks. There wasn't really a ton in between. Hopefully these numbers gave you a little bit of insight and help into drafting your roster this year. And do not forget, before you get out of here, you have to hit that like button for me. You gotta subscribe to the channel and make sure you answer the question that I gave you earlier in the video, because if this video gets 750 likes, I'm gonna pick someone who answers my question in the comments below to win a free draft guide. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Peace out, stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch y'all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.